A cream-colored envelope sat on a desk in Ohio, addressed by hand in steady, old-fashioned script. Inside was a single invoice, one line item, $47,281.50. The accounts clerk thought it was a joke. Her manager laughed out loud when she showed him. He shouldn't have. Because the man who sent that invoice had spent 11 years proving a number that nobody at that company had bothered to calculate. And by the time they understood what they were laughing at, the math was already finished. This is what happens when a company spends a decade calling something garbage, and the man receiving it never once agrees. Arthur Hemlock was 61 the spring they put up the fence. He had his father's hands before he had much else. Broad through the palm, permanently creased at the knuckle, the kind of hands that had spent 40 years learning what a dovetail joint should feel like before it looked right. In Oak Haven, people knew two things about Arthur. His joinery was the quietest, most exacting work in 3 counties, and he never threw anything away. Not a bent nail, not a stripped screw, not a sliver of wood longer than his thumb. His workshop told you everything before he said a word. Coffee cans lined the shelves, hardware sorted by size, each one labeled in the same careful hand that would, 11 years later, appear on an invoice nobody saw coming. This was not a habit, it was an inheritance. His father, Thomas, had taught him that waste was not a category of material. It was a failure of imagination. Thomas had learned that from his own father, who built his house and barn from lumber salvaged out of a collapsed mill after the flood of 1913. 3 generations, 1 rule. You do not call something worthless just because you cannot see its use yet. Before the fence, before the factory, the western edge of Arthur's land had been nothing but wild cherry trees and blackberry brambles for 77 years. It was a soft border, the kind that exists when nobody needs a line drawn. Arthur's grandson, David, used to chase rabbits through those brambles as a boy, scraping his knees, coming home smelling like crushed berries. Arthur would sit on the back step in the evening and watch the boy run, and somewhere in that stretch of land, he saw 3 generations folded into one view. His father's flood lumber still holding up the barn roof, his own hands at the workbench, and a child who didn't yet know what any of it meant. It was an ordinary kind of peace, the kind you don't notice you have until something draws a hard line through it. In the spring of 1999, that's exactly what happened. 1,240 feet of 4-foot chain link went up along the western border in a matter of days. On the other side, 14.6 acres of graded earth waited for an 80,000 square foot building. Precision Pre-Fab LLC was coming to Oak Haven, and the cherry trees came down to make room for the fence posts. The factory was a marvel in its own way. Trucks rolled in carrying kiln-dried Douglas fir from Oregon, southern yellow pine from Georgia, laminated veneer stock all the way from Quebec, premium material, cut down by computer-controlled saws with a tolerance of 1/16 of an inch. Beautiful work, if you measured beauty in precision alone. But precision creates leftovers. Thousands of them. Pieces of perfectly good lumber, 6 inches to 4 feet long, too short to feed back into the machines, too inconsistent to bundle and sell. On the company's books, it had a name: processed generated waste. $1,500 a month to haul it to the landfill. Arthur watched the yellow dumpster fill for the better part of a year. Pristine lengths of Douglas fir, blocks of laminated maple, sheets of void-free Baltic birch plywood, all of it carted off like it had never been worth a thing. It offended something in him that ran deeper than thought, the way it would offend a craftsman to watch someone use a chisel as a screwdriver. In November of 2000, he finally walked over to the loading dock. The shift foreman, Bill Peterson, 55 years old, bad knee, the kind of man who'd seen enough of the world to stop arguing with it, was overseeing the dump when Arthur approached, slow and quiet in his canvas coat. He pointed at a flawless 3-foot piece of fir. "Can I have that for my wood stove?" Bill looked at Arthur, looked at the dumpster, looked back at Arthur. "Take what you want, old man. It's all going to the dump anyway. Just stay clear of the forklift." Fewer than 20 words, no paper, no signature, just 2 men of a certain generation agreeing on something that didn't need explaining. The next day, Bill told his forklift driver to skip the trip to the main dumpster. Just tip the offcut bin over the fence into the back corner of the old man's lot. Saved a trip, saved a little dumpster space, solved a problem for everybody. Nobody wrote it down, Nobody asked what it would look like in 5 years, or 8, or 11. For the next decade, 2 or 3 times a week, a forklift would rumble to the back fence and send a cascade of wood crashing down onto Arthur Hemlock's land. And what grew there, piece by piece, season by season, would eventually become something far larger than anyone standing at that fence in November of 2000 could have imagined. To anyone driving past on the county road, it looked like a mountain of junk, a messy testament to an old man holding on to things he should have let go of years ago. David, 11 years old when the dumping started, was embarrassed by it the way only a child can be embarrassed by something they don't understand yet. He called it Grandpa's trash heap, and he wasn't entirely wrong to call it something. From the road, that's all it looked like. But Arthur never once saw a pile. He saw inventory. Every evening after the workshop closed, he spent an hour at the fence line, wearing the same leather gloves his father had worn, palms darkened with 40 years of oil in use. He sorted by species, the reddish cast of the fir, the pale cream of the maple, the rare heavy grain of oak. He sorted by dimension. He sorted by quality, checking every piece for knots and splits, sending the damaged wood to a firewood stack that stood exactly 6 feet high, neat as a fence line itself. The good wood, the clear-grained, properly dimensioned heart of the factory's waste, he treated like it mattered, because to him, it did. He used a method his grandfather had taught him, called stickering, a foundation of heavy timbers to keep the wood off the wet ground, a course of boards, small uniform blocks laid across them, the stickers to leave a 1-inch gap of air between every layer. Wood needs to breathe, Arthur would say, if anyone asked, which they rarely did. It needs time to settle, to release what the milling put into it. The factory's kiln only did half the job. The rest took patience. By 2005, he had logged an estimated 10,000 board feet in his weather-beaten notebook, material that would have cost a commercial buyer nearly $20,000. To Arthur, the number on paper meant less than what the wood could become. That was the year he built the first shed from scratch, a modest 12 by 24 feet with a gambrel roof, framed in salvaged Douglas fir, sheathed in plywood scraps he'd squared by hand and fitted like a puzzle. David, 17 now, helped some weekends, mostly out of obligation. "Why don't you just buy the lumber, Grandpa? It'd be faster." Arthur didn't look up from the truss he was building. Faster isn't the point. Better is the point. By 2008, that first shed was full, and Arthur started on something larger, a 30 by 50-foot barn, framed in 6 by 6 posts, pulled from the same fence line waste that David still called trash. It took 2 years. David, now away at college studying business, came home one summer and stood in front of the half-finished barn shaking his head. This is the world's most overbuilt storage unit for a pile of garbage. He loved his grandfather. He just couldn't see what the old man was building toward. And from where David stood, raised on spreadsheets and return on investment, there was no toward. There was just a stubborn old man losing a quiet argument with the modern world. "You could make more in an hour at the mall than you save messing with this for a week," David told him once, standing in the sawdust with his arms crossed. Arthur kept planing a board, the shavings curling up in pale ribbons. He held it to the light, checking for flatness. "You're confusing price with value, son. They aren't the same thing." David didn't have an answer for that. He didn't think there needed to be one. He went back to school, and the gap between what his grandfather believed and what David had been taught to believe kept widening, season after season, the same way the wood stacks kept growing behind the fence. In the spring of 2011, the ground shifted under all of it. Precision Pre-Fab was acquired by a larger national company. The old plant manager, the man who'd approved that 20-word handshake back in 2000, retired without much fanfare. In his place, the new owners sent a 34-year-old named Mark Jennings, fresh off an MBA from Penn State, a certified Lean Six Sigma black belt, the kind of man who walked a factory floor with a tablet and a stopwatch, hunting for anything undocumented, unaudited, unjustified. He found it on his third day. A forklift driver hauled a bin of offcuts, not to the main dumpster, but to the back fence. "What is that?" Jennings asked the new shift foreman. The foreman shrugged. "Oh, that's just the deal with the old guy next door. We dump the scraps, he cleans it up." Mark Jennings did not like deals. He liked contracts. He pulled the property records. He pulled 5 years of disposal invoices, $1,500 a month, $18,000 a year. He pulled up the satellite image of Arthur's land and saw for the first time the true size of what had grown there. To Jennings, trained to see every situation as a set of quantifiable variables, this was both a liability and an opportunity. The liability, an undocumented, uninsured arrangement that could become a legal nightmare if the old man ever got hurt or claimed the wood was contaminated. The opportunity, a resource the company had been giving away for free for over a decade without ever once putting a number on it. He decided to fix both problems on the same Tuesday afternoon. Jennings found Arthur in the workshop, sharpening the blade of a hand plane that had belonged to his grandfather, a Stanley Bailey No. 7, 1.5 feet long, the kind of tool that could shave a board down to 1/1000th of an inch in the right hands. Arthur Hemlock? Arthur finished tightening the cap iron screw before he looked up. Jennings got straight to it. The company couldn't continue an informal arrangement. Legal exposure, efficiency, all of it. But he had a proposal. $100 a month, a formal lease, the back corner of Arthur's land designated as a debris staging area. The company would handle everything. All Arthur had to do was cash the check. He smiled the smile of a man who believed he was solving a problem generously. Arthur set the plane down, wiped his hands on a rag. "The wood isn't debris," he said. "It's lumber." Jennings' smile thinned. "With respect, Mr. Hemlock, it's a waste product. I'm offering $1,200 a year for something my company currently pays to throw away. That's a win-win." "No." The quiet finality of it caught Jennings off guard. He was used to counteroffers, not refusal. He tried again, harder this time. Either a formal agreement or the deliveries stopped, effective in 30 days, and the existing pile, now a documented safety and environmental concern under town ordinance, would need to be fully cleared by that date, or the company would notify code enforcement. He wasn't being cruel. He was simply a man whose entire world ran on systems, stating how his system worked. Arthur picked the plane back up, testing the edge against his thumb. "You do what you have to do." That evening, David, home from college, 22 now, found his grandfather oiling the rosewood handle of the old plane like nothing unusual had happened. "A guy from the factory came by, said he's stopping the deliveries." "I know, I spoke to him." "And you just let him?" David's voice cracked with frustration. "That's free lumber for life, Grandpa. $100 a month for nothing, and you said no?" "He was offering to pay me to store his trash. I'm not a junkyard." "It's not trash. It's what you've used for 10 years. The wood has a purpose, David. It's not done yet. Just be patient." Patience was not a word that meant much in Mark Jennings's world. The certified letter arrived the next day. Formal notice, 30 days, October 31st deadline. The threat of code enforcement spelled out in language colder than anything Bill Peterson had ever said at that loading dock. The story moved through Oak Haven the way stories do in small towns. Some people thought Arthur was finally getting what a hoarder deserved. Others saw a local character being pushed around by a company that had never once asked his name until it needed something from him. From his office window, Jennings watched the property and saw no activity. He assumed the old man was calling his bluff. He made a note in his calendar, November 1st, call code enforcement, and went back to his spreadsheets. What Jennings couldn't see from that window was everything that mattered. For the past year, quietly, almost invisibly, Arthur had been buying machinery. A 1950s Delta table saw with a 5-horsepower motor, $300 at a farm auction. A 24-inch jointer from a high school shop program that was closing down, $500 for a machine that would have cost $15,000 new. A bandsaw, a drill press, a full dust collection system. He paid cash for all of it, hauling iron home on a borrowed trailer, spending 6 months restoring and rewiring each piece in the evenings after his regular work was done. He wasn't clearing the pile, he was preparing for it. In the last week of October, the work began. David, convinced his grandfather had finally lost the thread completely, wouldn't help. So Arthur hired a young man from down the road for $15 an hour, and the two of them started, not at the messy front of the heap, but at the back, where the oldest, most fully seasoned stack stood. No chipper, no dumpster, just a wheelbarrow, moving wood piece by piece into the barn, Arthur directing every placement, leaving clean aisles for the machines he'd spent a year restoring. The chaos at the front of the pile had always been a facade. Behind it, for over a decade, Arthur had been building an orderly, mature, fully cataloged inventory of raw material, and on October 31st, the last truckload moved indoors, and the ground along that fence line stood bare for the first time in 11 years. Mark Jennings saw the clear earth from his window and felt something close to relief. Clean, efficient, resolved without a fight. He marked it down as a quiet professional win and didn't think about it again until 9 the next morning, when his secretary told him Arthur Hemlock was in the lobby. Arthur wasn't holding a complaint. He was holding a single, thick, cream-colored envelope. "I believe this is in order," he said, and handed it over. Inside was the invoice. One line: storage, sorting, and curation of raw materials, November 2000 to October 2011. $47,281.50. Jennings laughed. Short, sharp, disbelieving. "What is this? A joke?" "It's not a joke." Arthur's voice never rose. "You said the wood was waste, that it cost $1,500 a month to dispose of, $18,000 a year. Over 11 years, that's $198,000 your company didn't spend. I saved you that money. I stored it. I cared for it. I kept it out of a landfill. I'm charging you less than a quarter of what I saved you. I think that's fair." Jennings' face moved from amusement to something harder. "This is extortion. We had a verbal agreement. You could take the wood for free." "We had an agreement that I could use the wood." Arthur reached into his coat pocket and produced a small, hand-carved key. "I have. I'd like you to come see how." David, who'd followed his grandfather to the factory expecting to apologize for what he assumed was an old man's confusion, went pale by the door. Jennings followed Arthur across the lot, through the gate, onto the 3.2 acres that had absorbed 11 years of his company's leftovers, past the house, past the old workshop, to the barn. A new sign hung over the doors. A single piece of laminated Douglas fir, 3 feet wide, 10 feet long, the letters carved deep and clean: Hemlock and Son, Custom Millwork. Arthur turned the key. The door swung open, and the light from the high windows fell across a fully equipped professional mill, restored machines standing like iron sculpture on a clean concrete floor, and to either side, filling the wings of the barn, thousands of board feet of lumber, sorted, seasoned, ready. An inventory built entirely from what one company had spent 11 years calling garbage. David stepped in behind Jennings, his mouth open, seeing, for the first time in his life, exactly what his grandfather had been building while David called it a trash heap from the safety of a business school 3 hours away. Arthur walked to his old notebook, opened to a page of careful calculations. "I estimated the board footage of every delivery, used your own annual reports to find the market price you pay for raw stock, discounted it 50% for the smaller dimensions. That invoice is my cost for storing and curating your material for 11 years. You called it waste disposal. I called it inventory financing." Jennings stood in the center of a room holding tens of thousands of dollars of what his spreadsheets had once called worthless, and understood for the first time that the old man hadn't been slow to react to his threats. He'd simply already finished the calculation 11 years ago and had been waiting for Jennings to catch up. The lawyers got involved. There were meetings. Arthur never argued and never threatened. He sat at the conference table with his calloused hands folded and waited, the way he'd waited 11 years already. They settled. Precision Pre-Fab paid $15,000 and signed a 10-year contract. All future offcuts sold to Hemlock and Son at 10 cents on the dollar of original cost. Jennings wrote it up as an efficiency win for his quarterly report. Technically, he wasn't wrong. But the real win belonged to the man who'd spent a decade being laughed at for refusing to call something worthless. David never went back to finish that business degree. He became his grandfather's apprentice, then his partner, learning to read grain, to sharpen a blade until it would shave the hair off his arm, to understand the difference his grandfather had been trying to explain to him in the sawdust years earlier. Arthur worked the mill for 8 more years. He died at 80, quietly, in his sleep, leaving the house, the land, and a thriving business to the grandson who once called his life's work a pile of trash. A cream-colored envelope sat on a desk in Ohio once, addressed in steady, old-fashioned script, and the woman who opened it thought it was a joke. It wasn't. It was 11 years of patience, finally presented as a number nobody else had bothered to calculate. On the wall of the mill's office today, framed beside the front door, hangs a copy of that original invoice, $47,281.50. David walks past it every morning on his way to the saw. If someone in your family has ever held on to something everyone else called worthless, A piece of land, an old skill, a stubborn way of doing things. Maybe it's worth asking what they were actually counting. All those years, nobody else was paying attention.